Hi, everybody. Today's May 31st, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me the ever brilliant and erudite Dave Cavena. Dave has been writing at The Pipeline, and he can explain a little bit of his focus. It's on climate and rationality. Dave, tell us what's been on your mind.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I've been working for the pipeline for a while. We focus on climate mostly. It started after the Keystone Pipeline debacle, and it's a great site run by Michael Walsh. There's several writers on it, and he asked me to join him, and I've been writing there for a couple of years. My background is I grew up in Southern California. I hike, backpack, camp, scuba dive, ski, water ski. So I like the outdoors and I want it clean, but giving up modernity for the hoax of climate change doesn't work for me.
So you said hoax. Can you tell us how can 97% of scientists be wrong?
Well, that's a good question. I'll get to the 97% in answering it, but let me start with this whole thing began with Michael Mann publishing the hockey stick. And everybody who talks about global warming and climate change knows what the hockey stick is. The problem is he published that in Nature magazine, and the next issue, it was absolutely savaged by a lot of scientists, including MIT and various other people. The data that he used included some data that he was told in advance wouldn't work, climate tree ring. When that was removed, you didn't have any pattern at all, let alone a hockey stick. He knew this, and he published it. Mark Stein, a columnist, said this is, it's false stuff. Michael Mann sued him. In discovering that lawsuit, the judge told Mann to show his data. He refused to do that. You can take your own conclusion about why a guy who brought a suit to defend his data would refuse to present that data. But he lost his own lawsuit. So there's never been any there since the hockey stick. As far as the 97%, that's an interesting discussion. The person who sent out a bunch of questionnaires to a bunch of scientists filtered those when they came back in. And I just read you something from Forbes that said Cook, who took a look at this stuff, was able to demonstrate a handful of those papers that endorse the view that the Earth is warming and human emission of greenhouse gases is the main cause. Main cause meaning over 50%. The problem is if you look at that data, the answer really is that, and several economists looked at that data, and the answer is if you get rid of the filters, if you throw out the papers where they didn't meet his initial criteria, that 97% becomes 1.6%. So 1.6% of the respondents answered that they believed a significant portion, meaning over 50%, of global warming was due to man-caused interruption. So 1.6 doesn't sound at all like 97%, but 97% sticks in everybody's mind. It's never been true.
Well, it's also one of those things that, 97% of people can be wrong about many things. Galileo had a tough time. Copernicus had a tough time. Einstein had a tough time. I think Galileo probably had the toughest. Being the nature of science always, I always like to tell people there's two definitions of science. One is the body of knowledge, and the other is essentially the act of science, the scientific process. And the act of scientific process, almost ipso facto, is a questioning of everything that had preceded. So the second definition of science is almost always inimical to the first definition of science, because you're supposed to challenge that body of knowledge to see if it has the heft and the reproducibility independently to warrant staying in the first category of science.
Exactly. How many thousands of years did people believe that the solar system rotated around the Earth? That was consensus. Consensus doesn't have anything to do with science. The scientific method, as you said, is let's come up with a hypothesis, see if we can falsify it. What are we not allowed to do with the global warming hypothesis? Try to falsify it. Every government grant is intent on confirming this hypothesis rather than trying to falsify it. Instead, they falsify the data. If you look at the data, there is no global temperature set that has not been modified by NASA or East Anglia crew to change that data to fit their model. In addition, recently, and I talk about this in one of my papers, the NOAA, the Navy, they did a global temperature check on the ocean. Now, the ocean moves heat around the planet more than anything else. And they found out, oh my goodness, the planet's cooling. But then they adjusted the data, and all of a sudden the cooling disappeared. You always have the troposphere, which for the 43 years we've been looking at it with satellite measurements since the space age began, it's shrunk 43% recently. Well, things shrink when they get cold. It's getting colder. So they modified that data. Then we've also got, NASA says we're entering probably the deepest solar minimum in a couple of centuries. What's a solar minimum? Well, when a solar minimum happens, people ice skate on the Thames. If you're of a certain age and you're in a movie called Hans Christian and the Silver Skates, it was all about ice skating on the Zuider Zee. These were normal things 100 years ago during the last solar minimum, big solar minimum. So it might be getting a whole lot cooler while we're closing farms, terminating farmers, and pretending it's going to get really, really hot.
No, it's an amazing thing. So I'm fortunately I'm sitting down while you're telling me that some of our temperature vagaries might be related to the sun. That's a little bit tough to take because I know that man pretty much does everything, and I'm actually proposing we do a probe to the sun, but we go at night when it's cooler.
I think that's a good idea. That would be just as scientifically valid as the global temperature data sets the climate change crew is using.
So new solar minimum. So when was the last time, what you said last time we had one was how long ago? You mentioned like the Zuider Zee. That's 100 years ago, but there have been more recently. And just kind of, can you put this in the framework of the Time magazine covers? Our no pun intended, our societal barometer, how we're figuring these things out. What was the first declaration? Was it global cooling before global warming, then global cooling? I've kind of lost track.
In 1976, Time magazine had a cover that basically said that we're all going to freeze. The coming ice age, I think, was the title on that issue, and it talked about that we're all cooling. All the scientists say, the consensus is, and the thermometers all show, and we're all going to freeze to death. So were they lying then? Are they lying now? I mean, if the data hasn't changed, guess what?
So I'd like to kind of keep on track with our progress here, but just as a side question, when was the term climate change created, and by whom? Do you have a handle on that at all? And what was its purpose, and what does it actually mean?
Those are good questions. I don't have a time. I recollect just anecdotally, it's been the last 15 years. My understanding is, it was all global warming until the planet stopped warming in 1997. We've got an 18-year pause going on right now. And so since it wasn't warming and they needed to keep the control over society, that's what this is about, they had to call it something else. So, oh my God, climate change. And then they can blame everything on it. Now, one of the tropes they use is that we're going to have all this extreme weather. A couple of problems with that. A lot more people die when it's cold than die of heat. And the problem is that even the IPCC says, no, we're not going to have more extreme weather. And if you look at a lot of the papers on hurricanes, for example, the models all posit a warmer, drier world. Well, hurricanes don't come about when it's dry. They need a moist world. So the models themselves show that this idea of a whole lot more hurricanes is nonsense. And the IPCC, they say, no, there's not going to be more extreme weather than there is now. And number of deaths and damage from hurricanes has gone down over time. You have an event like Sandy, but over time, the trend is all these things cost less and inflict less damage.
Now, as far as these weather events, even if we were to stipulate that everything they say is correct, Um, and we'll do that just as a thought experiment briefly. Um, are humans, first of all, what would be the time frame? I mean, if it's a kind of like an asteroid appearing, even an asteroid you can kind of predict as it's coming. But let's say it was a sudden asteroid that just appeared movie-like. We have 10 minutes to figure out our world, or a year or something like that. Um, well, first of all, climate change doesn't happen like that. So on the time frame, even of the proposed worst case scenarios, are humans adaptive and adaptable in our individually or societally to deal with this? And have we dealt with things like this in the past? What would be the ramifications? And as a side question, for the supposed climate events that have occurred, are there more or fewer deaths, say, per population unit now than perhaps 100 years ago?
Because of climate? Yes, there are fewer, but that's due to a lot of reasons. If the temperature stayed the same or rose or decreases, as progress happens, the building codes become more competent, you get better shelter, better transportation, better roads, better vehicles, better advanced warning. And so all those things would impact deaths per climate, and they have nothing to do with climate. They have to do with how we react to our world in general. But as far as climate itself, deaths due to extreme weather have been declining as long as we've been measuring it.
All right, so let's kind of get back on track with some of your points. Well, I suppose we can kind of stipulate some of their arguments. What about fossil fuels? Are fossil fuels the problem? Should we get rid of them? What are your thoughts about that? And what direction, if we were to believe everything they say, what would be the right course of action?
I talked about a couple of the articles. I think a better question is what happens when we run out? Because at some point in time, we're going to run out. Was peak oil in 1970, 2000, last week, next year, next century? At some point, we'll run out. We need replacement. There's no question about that. Does it need to be in the 12 years that a certain congressperson has told us we're all going to die? No. Interestingly, we have the capability to deal with the creation of base load power that renewables can't provide efficiently, fairly quickly, and with something that's not ever going to go away. Finland, a couple weeks ago, finally brought online their newest nuclear reactor. Their electricity prices dropped 75%. Now, nuclear is net zero. It can go on forever. Current small modular reactors, thorium-based, are inexpensive. They just started being licensed by our government. Hungary and Poland are in the process of putting in networks of same. And if anybody's really serious about fossil fuels, rather than reverse modernity, we put in nukes. Even the head of the guy who founded Greenpeace says nuke is the answer. But our climate change folks, they don't like nuclear because Jane Fonda made a movie, and so we can't have that. But in reality, the answer to fossil fuels is we'll need them until we replace with something. We can replace them with nothing, which is what the climate cult wants, or we can replace them with nuclear, which works just fine, lasts a long time.
Yeah, no, I've always wondered about that. Like the John Kerry, Francophile. He doesn't, for some reason, doesn't want to emulate France's dependence on nuclear fuel. France made a decision ages ago to kind of be that, quirky, different, West European ally. I'm not even sure. I assume they're in NATO, but they like to go their own way, and they have maintained that kind of a French primacy, and they don't want to be beholden to oil to the same extent, say, Germany is. And we can kind of see where some of these allegiances ran afoul during the recent, Russian or ongoing Russian-Ukraine crisis, and when Germany, had volunteered to stop its nuclear plants, and then they forgot maybe this thing called winter, and then they were beholden to either freezing or making some agreement with Vladimir Putin. Um, what's going on in Europe? With Germany's abdication or self-abnegation regarding nuclear, are they going backwards on their pledges to decommission? And is there kind of a nuclear wave happening there and or elsewhere?
Well, there is a nuclear wave happening in Europe. Germany isn't playing. Germany seems to have decided that it's better to buy very dirty Russian hydrocarbons that they're still doing versus running a very clean nuclear environment. They're also pushing back within the EU against Hungary and Poland building a bunch of nukes, which is odd. I guess the Germans don't want to see their people looking across their eastern border and saying, how come electricity is so cheap over there and we're restarting coal and not running nuclear here? So as I mentioned, Finland price dropped 75%, and Poland and Hungary are building a whole bunch of nukes. We're helping finance that, and we're American companies.
What's the situation stateside? I mean, where do we hang with our nuclear power? Are we keeping up with it? And you've mentioned the amount we're spending on the green doggle, the boondoggle of climate. Could we, if we had taken those funds towards nuclear, where would we be? And where are we now with the status and state of state of art of our plants and or the science thereof and or the research towards making better next generation plants?
We just began licensing earlier this year new small modular reactors, as I mentioned a while ago. They're now available to be licensed. The problem is in construction and permitting and insurance and all the things that the government's involved in. We've spent, since 1993, OMB says we've spent $154 billion at the federal level on climate change activities. If we'd steered that $154 billion towards small modular reactors, would we be in a better place financially? Yes. Climate? Yes. Carbon? Yes. The price of our electricity? Yes. But the left won't allow that. Which leads into the whole discussion, is it really about the climate? If it were about the climate and we have a net zero capability for base load electricity inexpensively, we'd put in nukes. Logic would say, if you turn that whole phrase around, if we're not putting in nukes, none of this is about the climate.
I've often heard, I think there was a certain point at which, the kind of clean energy movement wanted nuclear. And then, of course, they moved on. They wanted solar. They want wind. But there's a problem. I can't remember. I wish I saved it. But somebody said it's the left is not. The left is going to be against any type of energy modality that works. And you hear, as wind turbines or windmills get put up, these are, they're environmental people who say, oh, you can't have them here. This is blotting the environment. You can't have them in, Nantucket Bay. You can't have them, so forth. And they're killing birds. And then solar, it requires all this mining and all this waste and so forth, slave labor, whatever, China. Whatever gets proposed as the interim solution is always going to be torn down anyway. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Have you seen pushback on some of the, proposed quote unquote green solutions?
I haven't seen pushback per se from any government or permitting company. And I think that's because, as I mentioned earlier, if you have insurance and permitting and government involvement, they're going to do what the government wants. But your comment on stuff is on mining and materials and birds. And I've got articles. We've got articles. The whole crew at the pipeline has articles on these things. across the site. But I posted something probably a year and a half ago that came out of Real Clear. A rough conclusion is getting all of our electricity from wind, solar, and batteries. Now listen to these numbers. Would consume 70% of all copper currently mined in the world, 337% of global nickel production, 3,053% of the world's total cobalt production, 335% of the US's iron production, and 284% of the US steel production, along with a whole lot of concrete and concrete off gases CO2. You also mentioned birds. We're killing thousands of migratory birds. The same people who say we have to kill these birds passed the Migratory Bird Act 40 years ago. They were supposed to protect these birds. These birds have used these wind currents for millennia to get from point A to point B. And well, there's good wind there, so we put windmills up and chop all these birds to pieces. We're killing thousands of eagles and other migratory birds. We're also, these big, huge windmill blades are made out of balsa that's wrapped in fiberglass. Where's the balsa come from? We're mining illegally. People are going in and just stripping the Amazon rainforest. They're uncovering plants that aren't supposed to, didn't evolve for direct sunlight. We're leaving chains from chainsaws around. We're driving local flora and fauna away for a bunch of balsa that we put in a windmill for 20 years and then throw it in a landfill. Maybe this makes sense to some environmentalists. It doesn't make sense to me. There is nothing green about filling landfills with huge blades and toxic solar cells. And they're all going in a landfill in 15 to 20 years anyway. There's nothing green about green, except the money. Ask Solyndra.
No, you're absolutely right about that. I'm in a leafy suburb, and just the term leafy applies to trees. I have a couple neighbors visible, actually even more visible now than previously, because there had been I think 7 or 8 trees between our properties, and those got clear cut so that solar panels could be put up. It's a funny thing. They lost all the shade quality that the trees provide in the summertime that keep your house cool. And so now they have solar panels so they can have electricity and use air conditioners to keep their house cool. It's a funny cycle.
It's not your neighbors. In Scotland, they cut down 14 million trees to build a wind farm. What are trees? The second biggest carbon sink on the planet after the ocean. So let's cut down 14 million trees to plant a bunch of steel, balsa, and concrete instead. And by the way, some German companies also had a contract with a company in Texas. They're turning 58 tons of trees into wood pellets so they can send them back to Germany and burn them. Maybe it makes sense to cut down the carbon sink to create an increase in carbon by burning all that stuff. But I'm not clear on the logic there.
No, it's a funny thing. So how are we? Well, I just am curious. How are we dealing with all this? I mean, there's always a lot on our plate. You know, the right often gets called reactionary, but you know, it's you know, and the left gets the much kinder kind of progressive. But in point of fact, what they consider progress is not necessarily progressing us. It is doing something, and I suppose we're always hurtling forward in time. But you know, we say on the quote unquote right are, you know, having to react, and so the term is I think inappropriate. I think conservative is a better term. Because we're trying, in a sense, to be more conservationist, conserve forests, and I think nuclear is the most conservative option. And frankly, you know, there could be second wave nuclear or third wave, you know, if you consider the possibility of fusion energy, you know, just without even necessarily mining for uranium, plutonium, and whatnot. We could be, you know, sifting and differentiating heavy water, and there's a lot of water around. uh, it's so what can we do, and what kind of things that are we, forward looking progressively going to have to react to? You mentioned in one of your articles the very frightening 30 for 30, but maybe you can talk about other aspects. What are our, say, constitutional firewalls against some of the proposals that are being made? Maybe first you could elucidate what some of these proposals are: 15-minute city, 30 for 30, things like that. What's the next quasi lunacy coming down the pike?
Well, when we talk with start with the ones you mentioned. A 15-minute city is an idea that's evidently taking hold in England right now, where basically they lock you in, meaning you get fined if you leave. A city with a 15-minute radius. Within a 15-minute radius, you're not allowed to drive out. You have to walk everywhere. So they say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you got a store and a market and a hardware within 15 minutes? Okay, what happened to our liberty to travel? And if this is based on the climate, if they really cared about the climate, they'd put in nukes, not limit our freedom. 30 for 30 is an executive order that Joe Biden put in place that says by 2030, they're going to sequester 30% of the U.S. land and sea. So basically, they're stealing 30% of our land. And, there's a huge constitutional discussion about, is the federal government allowed to own any land other than military bases and D.C.? And there's some states pushing back on that. But regardless of that argument, taking a third of our country away for a hoax within 7 years, 30 for 30, seems extreme. And since there's no there in the whole climate discussion, as we talked about at the beginning of this, it's pretty clear this isn't about the climate. If they really were about the climate, again, they'd put in nukes. Biden and these guys also, as you know, there's a huge push on electric vehicles, which is crazy. We've got lots of articles in these things. Biden said last year that he wants us to build 500,000 charging stations. Well, we managed to drive 3.2 trillion miles a year in the US right now in 270 million vehicles with only 115,000, or 1/3 the number of gas stations. Also takes 5 to 10 minutes to put 400 miles worth of gas in my car instead of 4 to 8 hours to put it in an electric vehicle. Now they say you can do a fast charge. Well, if you do a fast charge too often, you destroy your battery. Batteries in these EVs are also exciting because all of the manufacturers have data on how to repair minor damage. Like you get in a fender bender and your battery pack gets scratched. They evidently don't like releasing that data. Why not? Well, the feds subsidize battery packs by count. So if I were a manufacturer and you had an EV and the battery pack got scratched, I'm not giving any tax dollars to tell you how to fix that scratch. I am giving tax dollars to build you a new battery pack. So we got hundreds and hundreds of barely damaged, scratched battery packs being tossed in landfills. This is not green. It's a real problem. So we're paying for more lithium, an extremely toxic mining process, extremely toxic mineral, to be used to build more batteries, where if we scratch a casing, we throw it away because we incentivize the manufacturer for new batteries, but not repairing a battery that maybe you bought last week. And we're not recycling this stuff. Less than 40% of these things wind up in a landfill in Europe, and they do a better job than we do. I mean, wind up being recycled. So it's just crazy. If we were to take these EVs and we were to replace those 270 million private gas vehicles with EVs, let me back up. We produce right now about 4.1 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity in the United States from all sources: oil, gas, nat gas, coal, nuclear, wind, about 4.1 trillion kilowatt hours. EPA has a metric which allows a conversion between a gallon of gasoline and how many kilowatt hours. If we replaced all of our vehicles with EVs, we would need to add 4 trillion kilowatt hours. We would need to double the electrical generating capacity of the United States. And it couldn't all be renewable because most of us, well, I don't have one, but most people with EVs charge them when the sun's not up and the wind's not blowing. So it doesn't work. You can't get there from here.
Now, it's a funny thing. Moreover, the oil and gasoline would not cease to exist, and the ability to get them would not cease to exist. And even if they were somehow black marketized, outlawed, there would become a hidden marketplace for these fuels, and they have their own value that would not decline because they are able to be burned to produce energy. And so, at one point I saw, I think it was an actual vehicle towing, a small, gas generator, and with the generator plugged into the side of the electric vehicle. And so, this is, I mean, it's essentially what an ICE, an internal combustion engine does. It uses electricity within the car to operate a lot of things. So it's burning the, your alternator is going to take the kinetic energy of from the pistons having converted the heat energy into kinetic energy. The kinetic energy, generates through the alternator, magnet pathway, electrons, whatever. Anyway, so you're going to get electricity, but these things are all in the same basic pathway, and in one form or another, every electric vehicle is doing that. It's not necessarily towing the direct fuel source, but if the majority of our electricity is from coal, that is essentially what you're doing, but one version worse than the guy who's towing his gasoline powered generator behind him. I've had on before the Manhattan Contrarian, Francis Menton, who's a friend of mine, has a great blog, the Manhattan Contrarian, and he talks about this conundrum of timing the energy, the quote unquote green sources, which are diurnal, based on wind and sun. And what you basically need would be to have some kind of buffer system, a battery generation, where you could offload some of the peak power into some other modality. This is a huge conversion mess. A total sidelight. At any rate, he points out the anomaly that you would need to have huge, backup power sources, and when in fact we already have these things in the form of gas, gasoline, oil products in general, coal, so forth, which can be burned any time of day or night. But just a sidelight, I was out west, probably in your time zone, but not directly near you. And then we visited the Coachella Valley, and the main intro through the I-10 from Los Angeles environs passes huge, acres and acres of wind farms. I'm not sure how many wind turbines that there are, but easily more than half of them were not working. And even in the places where they seem to be newer, probably a third of them were not working. And these were next to each other, so they were experiencing the same exact wind. It wasn't that the wind was dead in certain places, and so there were huge gaps. I mean, worse than a hockey player's mouth. There were just gaps in functionality between one place and another as we were going. And some of the earlier generation ones, they had maybe success rate of functioning, spinning windmills at about maybe 10 or 15%. I took videos of this to document it, but I had the same experience when I flew into Denmark last October, and Denmark presumably is more up to speed on this. They had them in the Baltic Sea, right off Copenhagen. And I saw farms of 30, 50 of these things, and a good solid 20, 35% of these we're not working at any given moment. What is the deal there? Um, are these things reliable? I don't know if you've followed this at all.
You're talking about Banning Pass. That's the pass that basically separates Los Angeles from Palm Springs, and it's full of the world's ugliest wind farm. I camp a lot in the desert. I've been driving through there for 60 years, riding or driving, and it's just disgusting. The ones that aren't turning, they either don't turn because they're broken, they're out of maintenance, or someone hasn't turned them on, or the wind's blowing too hard. I mean, these things only work to a certain wind speed, and it's above that, you lose all the energy because they can't turn because they'll get knocked over, which a lot of people don't know. But yeah, if you have too much wind or not enough wind, it don't work. The other point you brought up about cars is interesting. If you drive a Tesla and you're not recharging it with renewables, you're just kidding yourself. You're just, like you said, instead of creating the electricity or the locomotive power within the engine on site, you're creating it at a coal power plant somewhere, transmitting it over power lines, losing a certain amount of that power during transmission, stepping it down, and plugging your car into it. But you're running on coal. So they're just kidding themselves. Now, if we had a nuclear backbone, cool. You still have a problem charging it. 500,000 EV gas stations, charging stations, limited distance you can go between recharging, even more limited when it's cold outside. In Phoenix, a car battery lasts 2 years because it's so hot. What's the impact on EVs? I don't know, but it can't be good. I mean, basically, we've got over 150 years, 120 years of experience on internal combustion engines. Work fine, last a long time. And we're expecting to throw all that away for unproven technology. It's still charged via coal in the next 10 years. Now, a lot of people think, okay, California, for example, is going to outlaw the purchase of gasoline vehicles sometime next decade. Well, I'll just keep mine and we'll do what Cuba does. We'll just keep our cars running for 50, 60, 70 years. I would not be at all surprised if they don't outlaw gas stations. I mean, if the purpose is get rid of gas vehicles and have you replace them with electric, are they still going to let you have gas to fill up your gas vehicle? I don't know.
Well, there's kind of the law. There's common law, there's constitutional law, and then there's physical law. There's the law of gravity, and then there's the law of thermodynamics. No matter what Joe Biden might say or others, or who is actually Joe Biden's brain, there's some debate about that. First of all, whether he had one to begin with, but I'm pretty sure he did. But what people are missing here is that these, I was hinting at earlier, is that there is a thermodynamic quotient to oil, and it is undeniable that if you don't use it, somebody else will. And not only that, but you're going to be lowering the price for those others to use it. And a lot of these things are luxury items. Ages ago, I was behind the Iron Curtain on a quote unquote pleasure trip. And it was interesting. It wasn't that much pleasure because we were rudely shocked. We took bicycles from Vienna. We biked into Hungary and then through Czechoslovakia and took the trains and other things as well. East Germany and Yugoslavia at one point. But the environment was horrible. The stench, the smoke. It was the way people lived. To care about quote unquote the environment is a first world luxury of maybe second or third order. People who are living more at subsistence, and the irony here, of course, is that the socialist dream that a lot of people here adhere to, when it's actually played out, you can't have these same luxurious dreams of finding the exact right electric bike and this and that. These things weren't there. People were caring much more about getting fed and these other secondary concerns. They were getting the fuel and using the fuel as they could, and they used it as efficiently as they could, which was not very. And the same thing will persist if we all abjured and stopped using all these dirty, quote unquote, dirty fuels. Somebody, it's almost guaranteed will. Somebody in the Congo is not going to sacrifice getting his farm going or feeding his family by trying to maintain the same high quote unquote ethical standards that John Kerry would wish upon us.
I think of several comments. I'll try and remember them because unfortunately I'm not taking notes. As far as feeding ourselves, most people are aware that in the Netherlands, the government just started confiscating farms, and in order the killing of millions of head of livestock because nitrogen, because climate change. Now skip the whole part about the GHG, greenhouse gas, and the greenhouse theory has been disproved a whole bunch of times. Even if that were true, the Netherlands is second largest food exporter on the planet. How many millions of people are going to starve because these farms are being closed down? You mentioned Africa. The West feeds a lot of Africa, except the Netherlands won't be doing it anymore. But wait, there's more. Not only are these farms being confiscated, as part of the confiscation process, the farmers are prohibited from going elsewhere and farming. So you're taking the most productive, most sustainable, most capable farmers on the planet and prohibiting their farming. Now, maybe that makes sense, but not to me. Kerry, you mentioned John F. Do you know he served in Vietnam? Kerry, he spoke last week that they're coming after our farms too. Well, we'll see how that works. Our farmers might complain, but we have the capability to complain more loudly than the Netherlands. But the idea they're going to starve people to death over a hoax that because of the media, a lot of people seem to think is real is odd. Especially, let's go back, if we could just put in nukes and fix the whole thing. This is not about the climate. Also, I'll tell you something else, just as an aside. I was looking at there's a thing called EORI, Energy Return on Investment. It covers a whole life cycle of various types of energy. Now, anecdotally, years ago, Scientific American, they have a back page department, and they said, what's the real cost? What's the most efficient fuel from extraction to using it for power? And the answer was well-tuned diesel, more than hydrogen, more than coal, more than oil, more than it was better than everything. But this life cycle analysis from someone in Weissbach in 2013 ran out the ratio of energy delivered by a process of energy used directly and indirectly. This major published study showed, here we go, the results show that nuclear, hydro, coal, and natural gas power systems, in that order, are 1 order of magnitude more effective than photovoltaics and wind power. Nuclear is at the top of the list, 10 times more effective than what we spent $154 billion pretending can replace them. And it's not just us. The world, you may have read, the UN wants us to spend $2 trillion a year every year till we get to net zero, which is absurd. But here we go. Over 10 years, we've spent $2.5 trillion around the world on renewables, from which in 2020, the global engineering capacity was 7,000 gigawatts. $2.5 trillion for 4% of the global electrical generating capacity. Oh, but we can spend $2 trillion a year, that's just us, and get to net zero. Well, last week, our debt in the global debt rather, was $226 trillion. Where's this other trillions of dollars going to come from? I mean, again, there's no there there. And no one can afford this. There is no money for this. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of resources. It's harmful to the environment and the birds that fly in it. And we just get it all with nuclear. So if this were a climate problem, we would be pushing nuclear across the planet, like Finland and Poland and Hungary are. But
Right.
no.
There are going to be
John
other
Kerry was
places.
in front of Congress
Right.
last week, and he said, well, this is not a serious discussion, when someone said, geology stop? And the answer is, John Kerry's not a serious guy. We're not talking about serious issue. If the issue is the climate, we know the fix. If the issue is the climate, it's a cheaper fix. If the issue is the climate, we can fix it without destroying the environment. Forests, jungles, Chile, lake beds in Chile. We're not doing any of those things. So,
right. So I'm just curious, has anyone discussed this with Saudi Arabia / Iran, Iraq, and so forth, that they should stop producing oil? It would seem to me to be a difficult proposition that if the stuff is findable and drillable and producible, that it's going all of a sudden to stop being done. Stop producing money for states that hugely depend on it. The population of Saudi Arabia is not tiny anymore. I think it's quadrupled in my lifetime or more. I'm not positive. Maybe 60 million people or something like that, or maybe possibly more. Projected, and all of their efforts, and ditto, for the other petrostates, essentially, their wherewithal, their lives and livelihoods, and their futures depend on the extraction and sale of oil. Is China going to just acquiesce and not buy any? I mean, they might very well be making nuclear plants, because I think they tend to have a much more, sadly to say, engineering sense than, or they don't allow they don't allow this kind of crude politics, no pun intended, to obscure the most efficient pathways to their goals. So I imagine they are building nuclear plants, but in the meanwhile, they're not going to stop buying oil if that is the best and cheapest and most efficient thing to do. So, our little, it's almost like a play acting that we're doing to satisfy, the god of Al Gore, whoever the next generation of Al Gore is. And it seems much more, kind of self, self-flagellation, self-abnegation. I used it earlier, as kind of religious devotional. I don't know if you want to speak to any of that. But to the first point, do you think countries, Saudi Arabia is going to stop drilling oil to satisfy these sensibilities?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. One, no. But at the same time, where did Biden go early this year to beg for more oil? Saudi Arabia. The petrodollar became known as the petrodollar when the U.S. and Saudi signed a defense agreement back in the 70s. With whom did Saudi sign a defense agreement earlier this year? China. So they're selling oil to China. China's consuming, I think, about a quarter of the world's coal. They're building, I think, one new coal plant a week. We're bringing them online. They're completely ignored in the Paris Climate Treaty, Climate Accords, whatever they're called. Nobody cares about how much China's dirtying the planet or how much carbon they're producing, because I guess they're China. So I think that answers KSA, Saudi Arabia, and China. Interesting, I'm working on a paper now which talks about ranking some of this information, and just the working title, gigawatts per prosperity. If you look at, we generate, as I mentioned, 4,100 terawatts, trillion, about 41,000 terawatts of electricity. And we produce $20 trillion of goods and services, GDP. So we're using 0.2 kilowatt hours to produce $1 of economic output. China consumes 8.5 trillion, about twice what we do, kilowatt hours, and they produce $1.3 trillion of output with that. So they spent 3 times as much electricity to produce the same amount of output. I've also got an article on there. They produce 3 times the carbon, which tracks, to produce the same amount of output. So if we really want a clean world, we would onshore production and build nukes. But the elites prefer to offshore production to the dirtiest power generation environment on the planet,
Right.
while telling us we're all going to die in 12 years if we don't go to net zero. I mean, again, I don't repeat it. There's no there.
Right. I remember reading, I think you make excellent points, and I look forward to reading your article. I remember reading, oh gosh, maybe like 15, 20 years ago, maybe longer, something from the left, like Greenpeace or whatever, that, the United States uses whatever the fraction was, 60% of the world's fuel, yet it only has, I don't know, 10% of the world's population, whatever the numbers were at the time. And, you read this kind of stuff, and then it makes, anyway, as you look further, what they were missing was the output, kind of like the Netherlands. The United States is, I think, the largest food exporter in the world.
Yes.
And, so the question is, so we're using this fossil fuel, in this case, more fuel per capita. But what is the end result? Well, the production was massively higher. And of course, they're using a false dichotomy, because if you say, if you took the farmer in Pakistan, potentially, or using a donkey who's eating, say, hay and wheat or whatever, and not directly using gasoline, versus the John Deere. So if you had a deer, a mechanical deer versus an actual donkey, one of them is going to be on this fossil fuel equation, and the other is not. But which is more efficient, a donkey or John Deere? Well, John Deere you can turn on and off, so you're only going to be consuming the fuel when he's maximally producing. The donkey that falls asleep now and then, but does not have an on-off switch, so is basically combusting its own fuels. So they're not counting those fuels because they're not, quote unquote, fossil fuels. But as far as efficiency, if you had the farmers vote, Pakistan or wherever, they'd all choose the John Deere, over the donkey, unless you just want to run a petting zoo or something like that. But the net production is clearly and obviously higher when you factor in and incorporate fossil fuels, and when you're allowed to be the most efficient you can. Now, again, it doesn't have to be fossil fuels. Fossil fuels can be kind of the modality for certain things, and or can be electric, whatever. But in some form or another, you're creating energy. So the yield that you get is really what should be determinative, not the who's using what of this kind of false dichotomy.
Right. And as I just the numbers show you that we produce 3 times the output for input of electricity as China. Yet we're offshoring to China. It's like, that doesn't help the climate. That harms the climate.
So I wanted to just, this is a picture. I play golf once a week. And this is
Can I interrupt?
a picture.
We've talked, I want to go to the gas stoves, if you don't mind.
So I just want to show you this one
Go
picture.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a picture from a golf course I go to, and if you look closely over here, there's this thing over here is a weather station, I guess. Oddly enough, this is from a couple of years ago. There's vines growing on it. I'm not sure how well tended this thing is. Now they have the entire golf course upon which to put this thing, but where do they put it? They put it next to this. This was a hot day. You can't tell from the picture, but it's like a 80, 90 degree day. And this area here where they have the gravel and the asphalt is hotter than any other place. And so these are the things by which we are determining our quote unquote facts, our operative facts to make decisions about our data points of climate.
That's a really good point, and we had talked about that. If you look at the global temperature increase since we began measuring it accurately in the late 19th century, In the U.S. at least, it's gone up like 1.5 degrees. But we've urbanized a lot. A lot of the temperature measuring stations are in what the government, NOAA and NASA said are called urban heat islands. Well, they've gone up a little bit because they're an urban heat island. Well, if the whole country's temperatures have gone up 1.5 degrees, and the urban heat islands have gone up a little bit over 1.5 degrees, we could very well be looking at the entire rest of the country has been cooling. Because if you're going to average that out, guess what? So we're measuring in the wrong place, and we're measuring the wrong thing, and we may be completely way off.
Right. So we're rounding towards the end of the hour, and I'd like to stop soon. I want people to get a sense of where you're writing here. You can see one of your recent articles, and this is May 19th, Not the End of the World. People can click through and find some of your other pieces here. StreamYard's acting kind of funny. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to change windows easily. Yeah, it's not doing the right thing there. All right, so I'm going to stop the screen. I like to give a kind of a shameless self-promotion at the end. So I want to show my book in 1 second, but maybe you can give us a kind of closing words and advice and how people can either find you and or help out the situation.
Well, again, the website is thepipeline.org. There are several very good writers there, and me. Most of them are way more experienced than I. And we cover the environment, COVID, some other stuff, mostly the environment. And there's a lot of good data there. I would say if you use that data in discussion with friends, just like we've been using here, 97%, really it's 1.6. The world's getting hotter. We're going into a solar minimum. I mean, the comparisons are stark. The answers are easy. For the nukes, ask Finland. So ask yourself, is this really about the climate? Is taxing us for trillions of dollars to take away and reduce our liberty and freedom? I mentioned that gas, stoves, New York, etc. For something that has never shown to be proven seems odd. And the more people are aware of those things and can talk to legislators, whomever, their friends, the better chance we've got of not reversing the progress we've made since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm going to end with this. This is my book, Overturning Zika, and it's not quite related specifically to this topic, but it's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It refers to 2015-16 Brazil, the Zika virus, which is a real virus, supposedly causing congenital microcephaly, which is a real problem, an actual problem, but probably the two are not related. There's my self-portrait, and you can purchase it at Amazon. You don't have to read it, but you do have to buy it. You can help support our work here and more of these video casts. I hope that you will share this widely. And the book, by the way, is coming out in Brazil as we speak, pretty much. It's purchasable in Portuguese through a publisher, Visu. I'm hoping it's going to make an impact. But I think the common theme here is that 97% of experts agreeing on something does not prove fact. Everyone agreed that Zika was a problem causing microcephaly. It just doesn't happen to do so. That's the only problem with the theory. All the hypotheses have not borne fruit, fortunately for all the people, the billions of young families throughout the tropics, but nobody's been told otherwise. So they're still operating under the false presumption that Zika causes microcephaly, and the women, as a result, when pregnant, are staying indoors. They slather on insect repellent, both of which are not really healthful or helpful situations. And there you have it. Anyway, so thank you so much, Dave, for joining me today. You can hang around, chat for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else.
All right, thank you.
All right.